Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line. We start out in the direction in the Kupiansk front, where we see that the fighting continues in the direction of Avdiivka, as well as in the direction of Avdiivka, Kislivka and Leopard. And in this section of the front line, we have this video here which shows the first Ukrainian Leopard 1 tank being destroyed on the Ukrainian side. So we have this video here, where we see this Leopard 1 driving by one of the forest lines here in the northern part of the front line. It engages in some direct fire against Russian forces before eventually it gets shot at by artillery that hits right next to it, and from the splash damage it gets disabled, and further demolishment and artillery strikes against its position eventually renders it unusable, and the tank is abandoned by the crew, leaving it destroyed. Seems to be just one Leopard 1 tank destroyed, but this is the first confirmed footage we have of it happening. Moving on, we take a look at the direction of Bakhmut, where we see here that the Russian forces managed to advance in the direction of Avdiivka. So we see here that the Russian forces managed to, after consolidating the positions by Khomova here in the east towards Bakhmut, and in the plains here in the north, we now see them fighting in the direction of Avdiivka. The Russian forces are now in a position where they need to capture the village of Avdiivka to solidify their control over the northern flank, and then possibly go on to Kalinina, Hrivovka and so on to make a front line by the canal, allowing them to attack the Ukrainian positions here by Avdiivka and so on, west of Bakhmut, to solidify the positions here, and possibly negate the Ukrainian gains in the southern flank, where they need to fight in Avdiivka and Klishchivka to get a proper defensive position here, as the Ukrainian forces are currently contesting the Russian positions by the railways, as they managed to succeed in their offensive operations in the southern flank to capture Klishchivka and Avdiivka. However, the Russian positions are still strong and they're now fighting back. Speaking of Avdiivka, there is this video here which shows Russian forces bombarding Ukrainian positions north of Avdiivka by the forest lines. We see the video here which shows covering Ukrainian positions here to the north of Avdiivka. In the video, the Russian drone locates these Ukrainian soldiers in the trenches north of Avdiivka, and then artillery strikes right on their positions. As for the southern positions here by the rail lines and by Bakhmut itself, we see that there's this video here which shows a Russian vehicle ATV with Russian soldiers driving with high speed across one of the roads, where we see that an FPV drone on the Ukrainian side locates this vehicle and tries to hit it, but due to the high speed and maneuverability of the ATV, the Russian forces managed to avoid the FPV drone towards their position. We then move on to the direction of Avdiivka, where here in the north of the city, the Ukrainian forces managed to counterattack here by the water treatment plant here to the northeast of the city. They managed to push the Russian forces out to lose control over it, but the Russian forces still hold some positions here. And as I analyze with the picture showing the waste treatment plant from a 3D perspective, we see that the area here is located on high grounds, which allows them to oversee the Ukrainian positions in the Dacha area, as well as allow the Russian forces to launch attacks towards the coke plant. Therefore, this is a major development for the Ukrainian forces, allowing them to cut this control over the hill, allowing them to negate this advantageous position for the Russians. And now that it is contested, the Russians will have a hard time launching attacks towards the coke plant and advancing here in the Dacha area. So the position here continues to intensify as Russian and Ukrainian forces clash by the waste tip, which is the biggest high point in the area, allowing the Russian forces to overlook this whole area. Therefore, it seems that the Ukrainian forces must have a significant force to allow them to recapture this position and contest the Russian forces. We then move over to the Marinka direction, where we here see that fighting continues on the western outskirts. There's been no new advances in the area. However, a new report by Syriac Maps says that the reason for this development is that the Ukrainian forces is holding on to this city as a very symbolic representation of the Ukrainian fight against the Russians. Still holding on to the city allows the Ukrainians to increase the morale of its soldiers, showing that despite Russian efforts for 2 years, they've yet to conquer the city. And if we take a look at this picture here, we can see what it looks like from the Ukrainian position. We can see from the screenshot here from Google Earth, we can see that there are some elevations here and the horizon, which are these hills which we see on Google Maps. We see here and all around the Petrovsky district, here to the northeast of Marinka. There are all of these hills, also towards Donetsk itself. These are all areas in which the Russian forces can hold positions for reconnaissance, allowing them to oversee this area, which allows them to have an advantage when it comes to direct information from the soldiers on the ground, as well as artillery nearby. As for the city itself, it's very flat, and the outskirts here, which are still under Ukrainian control, are just like the rest, very flat. There's no elevation difference, there's nothing. It's just normal. Whatever there was before is the same that there is here by the outskirts. However, the big difference is we see here to the east and to the west that besides the residential areas, there's nothing. There's just open fields. Even the forest lines, they are far and far in between, which means that outside of the urban area, there's no place for concentration of any forces of any kind, which means that if the Russian forces manage to capture the last parts of Marinka, this whole area up to Avdiivka here in the west of Marinka will be open fields. And if we take a closer look at the whole area, the only other position is Pobieda, where the Russian forces have control over the outskirts. And if we take a look at this 3D map of the area, we see here that the situation is the same. Besides the few trees by the road, there's nothing. It's just completely open fields. There's trenches everywhere, of course. However, those are all vulnerable due to the open field. So this is why we're seeing that the Russian forces managed to gain control over the area here, because all that is in between Marinka, Donetsk, and this position here is just open fields. So whoever has better air reconnaissance and artillery firepower will be able to gain control over these areas. So how come the Russian forces aren't able to gain control over the area? That is because the Ukrainian forces will have an easy time detecting all of these positions and groupings of Russian forces all throughout the area south of Marinka, towards Donetsk, and everywhere in between, as this is just a whole wide area with no anything, just open fields. Therefore, if the Russian forces manage to capture Pobieda, this whole area in between this road of villages here to the south of Marinka and the northern parts here, so these two areas will be the only areas where the Ukrainian forces are. The rest here is just open fields with essentially no positions. Therefore, we see the Russian forces attacking towards Novomikhailivka here in the south, as it allows them to get closer to this strain of villages, which is where the Ukrainian positions are. In the northern parts, if the city of Marinka falls into Russian hands and Pobieda falls into Russian hands, then there's nothing to go on with, because the Russians would have to go through heavy fields fully, completely mined off, which would mean that the Russians had to suffer heavy losses, just like the Ukrainians did in Zaporizhia, to get through to the next Ukrainian positions. Therefore, we'll likely see the fighting switch over to Novomikhailivka and this road of villages, as well as continue westwards from Marinka towards Avdiivka and Maximilianivka here in the area. There's not a lot more to cover, therefore I'll end this video off here. There's a lot more 3D pictures where these came from, so make sure to let me know if you want to see videos where I dedicate the video to analyzing these 3D images of important areas like Uledar, Robotyne, Orikhiv, Avdiivka, Bakhmut, and so on, areas where there's a lot of fighting and where important battles have taken place, so we get a better understanding from these 3D images, and therefore we can get a better analysis thereof. So let me know which cities you want me to cover and analyze based on the developments. For example, the front line by Orikhiv to Novoprokopivka, I can go through, walk through, and I'm also potentially thinking of, if I figure out how to do it, live streaming while I'm on VR to look at Google Earth so that we can analyze it live together. And that's going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.